Hello! We are taking a brief look at some of the structural components of the Olivet Discourse. Now, the Olivet Discourse is located here in Matthew chapter 24. It is also located in Mark's Gospel in chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21. All of them follow fairly the same outline, although Matthew 24 is perhaps a little bit clearer. So to begin with, this is called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus is going to tell them some things, as it says down here, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. But in order to get the context of what's going on here, let's go back up to the beginning and simply read the opening verses of what the discussion is about to entail. So Jesus left the temple and was going away. So they were in the temple. They're leaving the scene from Matthew 23, where Jesus has just pronounced his woes upon the Pharisees. Jesus is leaving the temple, leaving the walled city, when his disciples come to him and point out the buildings of the temple. So they're seeing the big structures, the big stones, so they're all pointing that out. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Now right here it has to be pointed out that this was literally fulfilled in 70 AD when the Romans conquered Jerusalem and overthrew the city. The Jews had created such an uproar with the rebellion amongst themselves while the Romans were outside besieging the city. When the Romans finally get in, a soldier against orders took a torch and threw it into the temple, and so that the whole temple burned down. Well, there was a lot of gold inside the temple, and so the gold melted and it ran between all the rocks. Now, there was a considerable amount of gold there, and so the Romans, in order to get the gold out, literally took every stone off from each other. So it says, there will not be left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And so literally, they took stone upon stone apart from all the buildings. Now, if you see the western wall or the Wailing Wall, that was a stone retention wall. But it should be noticed, Jesus is saying, you see all these things, or as for... you see all these things, or as for what you see here, it says in some translations. And Jesus was talking about the buildings. Obviously, this was fulfilled very literally because the retaining wall wouldn't have been in view if the buildings were in view. And so, literally, everything that was seen there was thrown down because Jesus was talking about the buildings. But then they cross the Kidron Valley, they leave the temple, and it's a very short walk down into the valley and then back up to the Mount of Olives. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age?" So these are the questions that Jesus is going to answer. Now, it should be fairly clear to someone just taking a brief look at this. They're pretty much asking two, or you could say three things. Right here, they ask, when will these things be? That's the first question. The second question then is, what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? Whether you want to split that into two questions, that part into two questions itself, or leave that as one. This is separate from the when will these things be. And so we have to ask, what are the disciples asking about? When they say, for this first part, we can leave the second half of this alone for a moment, but when they say, when will these things be, what is their point of reference? What are they going to be discussing? Well, of course, the only thing they could be discussing when they say, when will these things be, is when his disciples came to him, they began to point out the buildings of the temple. And here, you see all these things, or as for what you see here. And so when the disciples are asking in verse 3, when will these things be? The only thing that they could be referencing here is, of course, the then visible buildings, as I like to say. The buildings that were visible then, or the second temple, Herod's temple. When we look at the rest of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, and of course, Mark 13 and Luke 21 are the same, when we look at the discussion, it is very clear what Jesus is talking about. Not only was this literally fulfilled, verse 2 here, but this is the question that is being asked Jesus. And Jesus' response it starts out very pointedly, and he says, "See to it that no one leads you astray." And so when we look at this, and when we see that what Jesus is talking about here, when will these things be? We see that since this was literally fulfilled in 70 AD, we know that the time frame of what Jesus is talking about, and we'll see this throughout the rest of the chapter, when will these things be, can only refer to the Second Temple. This limits the fulfillment of at least a large portion of this chapter to only be fulfilled historically, also called preterism, which draws its line directly and only to the 70 AD, because since 70 AD, the buildings that were visible then have not existed. Thank you very much.